Hi, Gene here with today's thought, and today we're going to be talking about taxes and tariffs. Donald Trump has floated an interesting idea, one that I actually would endorse. I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to give you the pros and cons of his idea, which is to replace the income tax with tariffs. But there is I'm going to do the pros and the cons, and there is one enormous giant blob of a con that would tell me, actually, I said a moment ago that I would support replacing the income tax with tariffs. Ultimately, I would if we were able to deal with this one enormous con. But unless we can deal with that, then I would have to say no for now, because there would be a great danger if we just take this suggestion and go with it without taking care of this big disadvantage, this big potential problem that you could pretty much predict would happen. But let's start with what he's talking about: replacing the income tax with tariffs. As you know, every product that comes into the United States just about has a tariff on it. That means we pay, it means for us, we pay more for everything that is imported into the country than we ordinarily would, because a tariff is added to the price of the product. Now, Trump, he raised the tariff on China on a number of their goods, maybe all their goods and services. He keeps saying, well, China's paying for it. We collected $100 billion or whatever the number is that he's using. That a tariff is a tax, and the tax is paid at the border by the person by the importer. So that is not. I heard an economist was talking about, Peter Marisi is his name. He was talking about this earlier today, the day I'm recording this, the day before you're seeing it, and he said that it would be partially paid. Now, Trump is saying that the exporter is paying for the entire cost of the tariff. The idea is that the exporter would have to lower the exporter's prices to keep the prices from rising too high because of the tariff. And that, in that sense, the exporter ends up paying the tariff. So he did say that it would pay, I believe he said 70% would be paid by the consumer and 30% or something would be paid. Don't hold me to that. I don't remember the exact percentage. The idea is that at least part of the tariff would be paid by the exporter, in a sense, by lowering the price. So to keep the price ideally the same to the consumer, and then you're not paying any more. But that's not the problem. Is that, okay, that's partially true, but now let's get to the pros. Now, first of all, the country, until the Constitution, the 16th Amendment allowed for an income tax, we were paying the taxes in the country were entirely by tariffs. Now, I gotta do something with my computer here, give me a second. The tariffs were the way that we paid our taxes. There was no income tax, and the country grew rapidly. And most important, we did not have the government spending that we have now. The government spending, it started with the income tax. The income tax, how did we get this income tax in the first place? It was supposed to be a measure of fairness. It was not. This is what is important. The budget, there would be some times a war, such as the Civil War, where the government would have to borrow and we would have an enormous deficit that would be offset, would be cured after the war ended. But at the time the income tax was allowed, the Constitution, 16th Amendment was passed, the budget was essentially balanced. We did not need the money. That is the point. We did not need the money. That was not the reason for paying the tax. The reason for paying the tax was for fairness, what Democrats say today. And Democrats, it actually was Theodore Roosevelt. It was it was progressive Republicans. Republicans used to be the progressive party, and it was their idea to have an income tax. And the income tax in those days was only people, it was very small. You can go on the you can Google, you can see the original tax form. It was only 3 pages, believe it or not. It was 3 pages. That was the whole tax form. And you paid, only people making over $6,000 would have to pay a tax. And people, you have to adjust for inflation. 6,000 was a lot of money. I'm not going to bother you. There are inflation calculators on the, internet. You can look it up, but that was, you were wealthy if you had if you were earning $6,000 a year. And that's why the income tax was allowed to pass, because number one, it was supposedly for fairness and was to keep other people's taxes down. You've heard this whole rigmarole before. Well, that's where it started. And people said, okay, well, who makes $6,000? So most of the country went along with it, but it wasn't too long before the income threshold went down and down and down, and the tax rate, which was very small, I think 3%, something like that, was up to, it eventually got up to 90%. That's what happened. Now, and what it did, it suddenly we had this spigot of money, this flood of money coming into the government. And instead of what it was supposed to do, this was the idea, to lower everybody, the poor people, the middle class, their income tax. The government, as they do today, spend the money, which is what always irritates me when I just heard Neil Caputo, he's a talking head on the Fox Business Channel, interviewing somebody saying, well, we have to raise the, we can't let the income tax expire. We've got this deficit. You've heard the story before. The problem is that the money from taxes never goes to reducing the deficit. Reagan learned this way back in his presidency. He cut taxes very low to something like 25%, the top income tax rate. The economy just took off like a rocket, but it was to be phased in over a period of several years. It didn't just suddenly drop to 25%. And Democrats came to him. Reagan wanted to cut spending, because that's what the problem is. As I said, the government will always spend the money if they get more tax revenue. And in fact, the Trump income tax cuts, after those income tax cuts, you had Janet Yellen. I don't know what happened to her. Just this administration seems to corrupt everybody who goes to work for it. And she should know that tax receipts went up 47% after the Trump tax cuts. But there she was saying that the tax cuts increased the deficit, and they did not. It was just the opposite. We got more money, and that's from cutting the personal income tax, and most important, the corporate income tax, which Democrats also want to raise now, and put up to make us, to return us to having the highest corporate tax in the world. What's that going to do for the economy? So the point is that this income tax created this flood of money that came in, and the government just spent it. Spent and then borrowed some more money. But they couldn't do that before the income tax, because if the tariff goes up too much, then what happens? Your products become more expensive, and you cut back on your purchases, and the government gets less money. So that was one of the advantages, and that advantage that you would have coming back if you had tariffs instead of the income tax, because we, the consumer, we, the American people, could control tax rates. Right now, the only way we can control tax rates is by, for whom we vote, because Congress can just raise the tax rate, and if the president signs it, and if you have control of the budget bills, it's called, it's the Byrd rule, Robert Byrd, that's the budget cannot be filibustered. That's immune from the filibuster, because we have to have a budget and we have to pass. So all you need is Democrats to control the House and both houses of Congress and the White House, and they can raise taxes. They can just raise taxes. And the But with tariffs, we have control. You can just spend less, and then the government will get less money, and that will tell us what we have to cut spending, and we have to keep these tax rates down because we will get less revenue if we raise taxes. So that's one of the advantages of going back to tariffs. Now, one of the, and you'll have, well, this is the big point, the big pro, because I live, and this should just be common sense, but I live in a no state income tax state. No state income tax in my state. I live in Tennessee. I used to live in New York. I saved, if you want to know why people are moving like me, I saved, at least the year I moved, I mean, I don't calculate it anymore because I live here, but I saved $3,000 off my taxes just by not having to pay a state income tax when I moved to Tennessee. But did you know that this job growth that Biden is bragging about? By the way, he just said, I just saw him claiming to have created 15 million jobs, which is false. The real number in 3 years is 6.2 million. The remainder is just jobs lost during COVID that came back when the COVID restrictions were lifted. Those were not new jobs created. That was the return of old jobs. So he's, as usual, he's lying about that too. Either that or he's ignorant. He doesn't know the number, the correct number. Just like he says that he inherited 9% inflation. No, the inflation rate was 1.4%. And for Trump's entire term, it was 1.9%, which is a tenth of a percentage point below the Fed's target rate of 2%. My opinion, it should be 0%, but I don't run the Fed yet. You're welcome to recommend me if you'd like me to. I'd clean it up in 5 minutes, or if not, I couldn't do any worse. Put it that way. But as you see, I don't have a lot of faith in the Fed. But the most of the jobs that were created since Biden's been president, half of those jobs, half were created in only 2 states. Well, let's make this a quiz. I'll give you a couple of seconds here. See if you can guess which are those 2 states in which half the jobs in the country were created. Tick, 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 tick. Time's up. Did you guess? Okay, well, to me, it's pretty obvious. Texas and Florida. Half the jobs in the country were created in Texas and Florida. What did they have in common? No state income tax. So you see the advantage. If that's true of all these states, all the economic growth, or the most economic growth that we've been having in this country, are in the no state income tax states, and low state and very low rates too. But the high income tax states like California and New York, Massachusetts, no, that's not where you're having. I'm not saying there aren't any jobs being created, but most of the jobs are in the no state income tax states. So common sense would tell you if that's what's happening because remember, we're a federal system and all these states, they are independent. A state is a small country. So you have the example of, as somebody said, I think it was a Supreme Court Justice Brandeis, I don't remember, but said that the states are laboratories of democracy because every state can enact their own policies, in this case, tax policy, and then each state can look at all the other states and see what's working, and that's why you're having, I forget which one state is one of the Dakotas, North Dakota, South Dakota, but no, Arkansas. Arkansas is talking about getting rid of its state income tax, which would make sense because Arkansas is right next to Tennessee, and Tennessee is growing. It's one of the fastest growing states in the country, and it has no state income tax. So what's true of all these little countries, the states obviously, or would seem to be obvious, would be the same principle would apply to all the states collectively, the United States of America. Now, the advantages are so great and you would have to cut spending. That's another pro. You'd be forced to cut spending, which is what we really need to do. As I said, the state, I wish, I don't have my hopes are not this great, but Trump should mention that this is what Reagan said. That the government will, the tax money that they would get, they would spend the money. And there are economists, liberal economists, arguing that, well, if you have tax cuts and people have more money, it would be inflationary. And Reagan asked the very obvious question. Why is it that you and I having our own money, spending our own money is inflationary, but the government taking our money and the federal government spending the money is not inflationary? Explain that one. So that would be the question for Trump to ask. Now, besides the other obvious one, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? So that's another question, or I would say 3.5 years, because if you go back exactly 4 years, that's the Trump administration. But if you go back, let's say 3 years ago, you get the point. But now we get to the cons. Now, there are two of them. One of them, I said, is very major. Now, the first one, not so major. It seems like a con, but it's really not. Is that if you get rid of the income tax and you try to pay with tariffs, finance the government with just tariffs, you're going to have to raise the tariffs quite a bit. Where I live in Tennessee, I said I have no state income tax, but my sales tax is 10%. There's no exemption for food, for instance. There is no, my home state of Michigan, if I remember correctly, and maybe they still do, has had a state income tax, but not on food. But Tennessee has a state sales tax, but not on food. So Tennessee has a state sales tax, and it does apply to food, and it's 10%, maybe like 10% and a fraction. So you pay higher. But let me put this in here. I don't know about California, but New York, where I lived for 40 years before I moved to Tennessee, my taxes in New York were 10%, I think 10.1%, or 10.25%, and I had the state income tax. So you can have, and this is the big con I'm going to get to in a moment, I had a state income tax and a high sales tax. But if you're in Tennessee, you're going to pay a higher sales tax, but you're not going to pay an income tax. So the former offsets the latter, and you can reduce your sales tax burden by just not buying a lot of luxuries or stuff, which is an incentive for Tennessee, my state, to keep the taxes, not to raise the taxes, because of what I explained previously, that people will just buy less and the government will get less revenue. But the big con, the enormous con, the giant con, is the one I just described that you actually have in New York, where you get an income tax and a sales tax. So the big threat is you could by legislation eliminate the federal income tax totally and go straight to a tariff, but then what prevents a future, probably almost certainly a Democratic dominated government, reimposing the income tax? So you have an income tax. So you've got your tariffs, your high tariffs, and now you have the income tax has come back because of the 16th Amendment. And this is what you have actually in England. You have what they call a VAT, a value added tax, where you don't just pay a tax at the retail level when you buy something. They have an income tax, and they have this VAT, value added tax, where every stage of production is taxed. So you mine the raw materials and you send it to a manufacturer. The manufacturer pays a tax on that. Then the manufacturer manufactures some good with that and sends it to a retailer, and the retailer pays another tax on that, and then it goes to the consumer, and the consumer pays a third tax. So you tax, and tax. And you have and Democrats have suggested doing that here. So you have this sort of Damocles hanging over your head unless you, as his name was Dennis Archer, a former representative, Republican, of course, from Texas, which would make sense, no tax state. But he said he advocated repealing the 16th Amendment, and the one that established the income tax. That's what you have to do before you go to a tariff. And in fact, I would put this in the actual amendment, repeal a single amendment that, just as we repealed prohibition with a future amendment, an amendment that repeals the income tax and goes to a sales tax, or goes to a tariff, or a sales tax too, or a national sales tax, one or the other, or just keep it simple, just straight repeal, pass the 28th Amendment. Then we have 27 so far, 28th Amendment. The 16th Amendment is hereby repealed. That would, then you could go to another tax system, and I would be all for it. But until you get rid of the 16th Amendment, then I have to oppose tariffs or national sales tax or anything that could leave us with additional taxes in addition to an existing federal income tax. And that's my thought for today. I'd love to hear yours, the comment section below the video. If you could subscribe, that would really be great. Share this video with anyone you think would benefit from it. But most of all, come back and see me again. I would love to see all of you again. And until I do see all of you again, bye.